There was once a kingdom so prosperous that its wheat shone like daybreak and its rivers ran as smooth as polished glass. In that kingdom lived a young princess named Adela. She was clever and quick of tongue, and her beauty was like a bell that drew crowds. But beauty, when praised too loudly, sometimes invites a colder companion, pride. Adela grew used to admiration as a swan grows used to water, and soon she looked upon others not as neighbors, but as mirrors that ought to reflect her radiance back to her. When she reached the age to marry, kings and princes came from distant courts, riders in cloaks lined with winter, envoys bearing silk in the colors of ripe plums, musicians whose harps sounded like rain upon a roof. Adela was seated beside her father in the great hall, a coronet bright upon her brow, to receive them. The suitors walked past in an elegant procession. Adela examined each with an appraiser's eye and a jester's tongue. "The first is tall," she whispered to her ladies, "but his manners are not. He bowed to me and kicked my spaniel. The second's beard is forked like a fish's tail. Does he think to swim to breakfast? The third's boots are polished like a pond, but I see only surface. The fourth's voice is honey, yet somehow I hear the buzzing of flies." Laughter rippled behind painted fans. Her father, the king, shifted upon the throne. He loved his daughter and delighted in her wit, but some jokes are seeds that grow into thorns. Last of all came a young king whose lands bordered theirs, a thoughtful man with steady eyes, dressed simply for one of his rank. The silver on his belt dimmed from use rather than newly shined for display. His beard was close trimmed and a little uneven, for he rode hard and kept his own counsel more than he kept barbers. When he bowed, he looked Adela straight in the face, not as one dazzled, not as one presumptuous, simply as a person greeting a person. "This one," Adela said, loud enough for more to hear than should have, "has the look of a thorn hedge, prickly and all bristle. Why, his beard is grisly as a thicket. I should sooner marry a briar bush. Begone, King Grisly-Beard." The hall went still. Even the fire in the royal hearth seemed to draw in its breath. The visiting king's face changed only a little, but those who were mothers recognized the expression, a patient sadness. He bowed again, not to Adela, but to her father, and withdrew without complaint. That night the king paced his study. "Daughter," he said at last when she came to kiss him, "wit without kindness is a sword without a hilt. Tomorrow at sunrise you shall choose a husband not from princes, but from those who pass beneath our window. The first man who pleases me for any decent reason you will wed." Adela thought this a jest. But dawn has a way of keeping promises that midnight makes. At sunrise the shutters were drawn wide. The city awoke in waves, bakers dusting flour from their forearms, traders rolling up stall canvas, washerwomen laughing with their buckets on their hips. A fiddler passed. Adela's father shook his head. A peddler of ribbons bowed. The king said no. A scholar walked by, reading as he walked. The king sighed. "I pity his shins." Then came a minstrel in a weathered cloak, carrying a lute, his step sure, his hair sun-browned, his face partly shadowed by a brim. He sang as he walked, not to gather coin, but because the song seemed to be walking too. His voice was warm wool, plain, honest, comforting. The king's eyes brightened. "There," he said, "a man who brings music to morning is a man after my heart." Adela stared. "Father, you cannot be in earnest. He's a vagabond." "A man is not made by his coat," the king answered quietly. "Today you shall learn it." The wedding was arranged with alarming swiftness and startling simplicity, a blessing from the royal chaplain, a ring as modest as a dewdrop, a loaf and a cup shared between them. Adela's gowns were folded away. Her jewels were wrapped and locked in a coffer to be sent later, though later often means never when a lesson is underway. The minstrel thanked the king courteously and set out with his bride. As they reached the city gate, he pressed a coin into the guard's hand, the last generous thing a poor man could do, which is often the most generous thing of all. Adela, who had always ridden with a retinue, now walked. The road out of the city felt longer than all the corridors of the palace. She complained of stones in her slippers and sun on her brow. The minstrel did not scold. He sang to set their steps to a kinder rhythm. They came to a rise from which one could see 3 kingdoms at once: Adela's father's realm, with its high towers; to the east, a country of silver rivers; and to the west, green hills folded like blankets. On one of those hills stood a castle of pale stone with banners snapping blue and silver. Adela shaded her eyes. "Whose castle?" she asked. The minstrel glanced sideways. "A king's." "It looks well kept," she said despite herself. "His people keep it so," he replied. "A palace is only as grand as the justice it shelters." They descended into a smaller town where houses leaned together like friends sharing a joke. At the far end stood a tidy cottage with a herb garden so neat it might have been combed. "Here's our home," the minstrel said. "Our home?" Adela echoed, hearing how her voice struck the air like ice. He nodded. "We shall earn our bread here." The cottage had 1 room below and 1 above, a hearth, a table, and 2 stools. Adela sank onto one and waited for servants to appear. None did. The minstrel rolled up his sleeves and set a pot upon the hook while she looked upon the spoon as if it were a relic from a vanished civilization. "I do not know how," she confessed at last, small as a child. "Then you shall learn," he said gently. "The spoon is not proud. It will teach you." Thus began the princess's schooling. She learned to sweep a floor without raising storms of dust. She learned that bread dough and people both rise better with warmth than with shouting. She learned that water carried from the well tastes of the sky if you drink it with gratitude. And because hands teach hearts, Adela's heart, unused to any labor but sharp words, began to find a steadier trade. Money was scarce. The minstrel played at inns for coin. Sometimes it was enough for eggs and onions, sometimes for only a crust. On thin nights he tuned the lute with a care that made Adela ache. She had never before watched someone coax beauty from poverty. To help, she tried weaving rushes into mats, but they came out lopsided. She tried spinning, but the thread broke more often than it joined. "I was a princess," she cried one evening, "and now I am a patchwork of failures." The minstrel set the lute aside. "You were a princess," he said, "and now you are a person. A princess is a ribbon tied to a roll. A person can be almost anything, especially after a few failures." The cottage door stood open that warm night. From the lane came the smell of stew and the sound of neighbors passing bowls. A tiny boy with a wooden horse paused. "Good evening," he piped. Adela returned the greeting shyly. The child grinned at her as if she'd given him a coin. Not long after, the neighbors began to knock. "Would you two come eat with us? We made too much. Could you watch my girl while I fetch the laundry? We're mending the lane. Bring a spade if you've one." Adela borrowed a spade. She had never before been needed for something only her arms could do. When the lane was smooth under the moon, when the little boy galloped his horse over the packed earth and whooped, she laughed from a place in her chest that had long been vacant. Work does not cure pride. It gives humility a place to live. Weeks flowed, summer ripened, and Adela's hands grew capable. But lessons seldom end with the first harvest. One market day the minstrel said, "Let us try our wares. You will carry the jars, I will play." Jars of what? Adela had found her success at last in glazing earthenware that the potter next door fired, blues like river shallows, greens like mint leaves after rain. She carried the basket to the square. People admired, haggled gently, bought. She remembered each face and wrapped each jar as if for a friend. Just then the Duke's steward rode in at a clatter, demanding tax arrears of every stall. Stallholders stiffened, Some reached for purses, some for curses. The steward's eye lit on Adela's basket. "Unlicensed," he declared, "confiscated." Adela, who had once frightened dignitaries with her blade-bright tongue, felt no anger now, only a clarity new to her. She stepped forward and spoke low enough to keep heat from the air. "Sir, these jars belong to our village as much as to me. They carry water for old women and stew for children. If you take them, you will thirst us. If there is a fee, tell me, and I will pay when the minstrel's hat is full. If there is an injustice, I will look at you so carefully that you will see yourself as in a mirror." The steward, who was not quite the villain his entrance had promised, flushed. The crowd held its breath. The minstrel played a soft minor chord, the sound of a conscience leaning forward. At length the steward dismounted, muttered something about new regulations, and pressed a coin into Adela's palm for the trouble. He left to rethink the usefulness of thunder without rain. The villagers cheered. Adela did not bow. She merely looked at the coin as if it were heavier than metal. The minstrel's eyes, however, shone. Autumn approached. The cottage garden turned from bright to useful. Beans hung like little green moons. One evening, Adela stood at the door with a shawl around her shoulders, watching clouds herd themselves toward winter. The minstrel came up the lane with his lute slung like a second heart. "Tomorrow," he said, "the castle on the green hill will host a festival. Tradesfolk are invited, music will be needed, jars will be bought. Will you come?" Adela hesitated. She had walked as a proud ornament in palaces. She had no wish to walk again as the ghost of her own past. But the neighbors clapped her back, and the potter thrust an extra crate into her hands, and so, after all, she went. The castle gates yawned wide upon a courtyard alive with lanterns. Banners, blue and silver, snapped like pleasant applause. Adela's eyes were drawn to a mosaic above the keep's door, a river winding through fields to a city. It stirred something old and almost tender in her. By noon, she had sold every jar. By evening, she had charmed 3 kitchen maids into trading recipes. At dusk, a trumpet sounded from the balcony. The lord of the castle stepped forth to speak. It was King Grisly-Beard. Adela's heart faltered like a foot that has missed a stair. The beard was neater than she remembered. The eyes were the same, steady as true north. He welcomed the townsfolk, thanked the trades, praised the music. His gaze passed over the crowd and did not pause upon her. And perhaps that was the keenest lesson of all. The minstrel tugged her sleeve. "Come," he said, "there is one more hall to see." They entered a long gallery glittering with candlelight. At its far end stood a mirror as tall as a door. On either side hung portraits of rulers stern and soft, cruel and wise. In the mirror, Adela saw a woman dressed plainly, hair braided like a villager's, posture unassuming, eyes alive. She forgot to be ashamed. "Who are you?" she whispered to the reflection. "Someone I like," the reflection seemed to reply. Footsteps approached, quiet, well-made. The king himself entered the gallery. He looked at Adela, not as one looks upon a miscreant or a prize or a curiosity, but as one looks upon rain after a long dry season. He bowed to the minstrel. "Your Majesty," he said. Adela turned sharply. The minstrel straightened. With one hand, he removed his weathered hat. With the other, he lifted the worn cloak from his shoulders. Beneath, he wore not rags, but a tunic finely stitched, the colors of his banners. He looked no taller, no more handsome, only exactly himself. But now his self had a name Adela could hear. "You," she began, and then stopped, because words which had always come easily now opposed her like stubborn doors. "Why?" "Because I wished to know whether your hand could ever hold what your heart had dropped," he said kindly. "Because I hoped the world could teach you what titles never could. Because I believed you might learn to love not a crown, nor a beard, nor a mirror, but a human. You place me in hardship, she said, not accusing, only keeping the account honest. I placed myself beside you in it, he answered, and found joy there. Adela's eyes filled. I have wronged you, she said, not by refusing your suit, that was my right, but by refusing your dignity. I called you a briar, I was the thorn. He smiled then, and the gallery brightened as if someone had trimmed all the wicks at once. A briar bears roses, he replied. You have learned to bear them too. She looked down at her hands, scarred now by honest work, steady in a way that would never again permit cruelty to seem clever. When she raised them, she did not offer apology as a performance. She offered herself. If you still wish it, she said, let us build not a palace of jokes, but a home of listening. Let us keep a cottage by the lane where people knock because they are welcome, and a seat at your table where truth eats first. King Grisly-Beard, who, truth be told, preferred simply to be called Rowan, nodded as if they had struck a fair bargain over a loaf. We will keep both cottage and castle, he said, and see that they learn manners from each other. Word ran as quick as a pleased child that a wedding would be held the next day. Bakers lit their ovens before dawn. The potter brought his finest bowls. The neighbors from the lane came with their spades and their laughter. Adela's father arrived as the sun climbed the tower. He saw his daughter standing plain and bright and new, and his sternness melted like frost off wheat. In the chapel, Adela walked the aisle on feet that knew roads. She took Rowan's hands, hands that had tuned a lute and signed a treaty, the same hands, and vowed not to be a jewel upon his breast, but to be a companion at his side, not to be entertained, but to be useful, not to be proud, but to be joyful. When the vows were done, the king turned to the crowd. Let this hall be a home, he said, and this home be a hall. Let those who labor eat, those who sing be heard, and those who rule remember that ruling is only a kind of service. That evening, lanterns dotted the courtyard like a second nearer constellation. Adela danced with the potter, the baker, the steward who had once blushed in the market, the little boy whose wooden horse had been promoted to charger. When she at last came to Rowan, he grinned. "Do you miss your throne?" he teased. "I have found my seat," she said, and folded herself into his arms. They kept the cottage by the lane. Adela still glazed jars on quiet afternoons, and sometimes stood at the door to feel the same wind that used to scatter her words now lift the hair on her brow with a gentler hand. When people came to the castle with petitions, she listened until listening itself did some of the fixing. When she spoke, her phrases still had music, but the kind that warms, not wounds. And the mirror in the gallery? It remained tall as a door, clear as water. Children ran to it to make faces. Old men paused before it to count the years with gratitude. Adela sometimes stood there too, not to admire a princess, but to greet a woman who had learned that grace is not the art of appearing perfect, but the courage to become better. So it was that an arrogant princess was taught a lesson, not by cruelty nor by humiliation, but by work, welcome, and truth. And so it was that King Grisly-Beard became, in the mouths of his people, simply Rowan the Steady, for he had steadied a heart and found his own steadier for it. If ever your tongue outruns your kindness, think of Adela, how she traded thorns for roses, mirrors for windows, and jokes for joy. And if ever you doubt that people can change, visit the little lane below the castle, where the jars are glazed the color of river water, and the door is always, always open.